Have you ever been judged just by the way you looked, before you even said a word? On a flight that should have been ordinary, a simple mistake leads to a revelation that no one on board saw coming. When appearances deceive, who will be left standing in the end? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The morning at JFK International Airport buzzed the way only a Saturday could. Rolling suitcases clicking across tile floors, soft announcements overhead, and that subtle air of impatience clinging to every traveler. Inside the Aurora Lounge, though, it was another world altogether. Plush chairs, muted lighting, and the quiet clinking of coffee cups created a bubble of calm where business-class passengers took refuge from the chaos outside. Amira Ellington stepped into that calm, carrying nothing more than a faded gray backpack slung casually over one shoulder. Her hoodie hung loosely over slim jeans, sneakers squeaking softly with each step. She scanned the room briefly, taking in the tailored suits and glittering jewelry, then found an empty seat tucked in a corner near a low window. She settled quietly, her presence barely rippling the polished surface of the lounge's exclusivity. At 24, Amira carried a name most at this airport would recognize in a heartbeat. Ellis Ellington, her father, was the powerhouse behind Skynova Airlines. But fame had always felt more like a burden than a blessing to her. She had no interest in flashing her last name like a VIP pass. Today wasn't about making an impression. It was about getting home to Atlanta, to a hospital room where her mother waited in silent battle against an illness that stole a little more of her each day. Amira pulled out her phone, double-checking her boarding pass one more time. Flight 612, C2A. She tucked the phone away and reached into her bag for a worn leather notebook, jotting down a quick list, grocery items her mother might want, questions to ask the doctors, little things to help her feel more useful in a situation where she mostly just felt helpless. The lounge doors slid open again with a whoosh. A group of sharply dressed passengers breezed in, heels clicking, laughter echoing, the air around them heavy with the scent of expensive cologne and entitlement. Their voices carried across the room without apology. They moved in a loose cluster, claiming seats as if the lounge belonged to them. Following close behind was Maureen Clifton, the lead flight attendant for the day's journey to Atlanta. She wore her uniform like armor, pristine navy blue, polished shoes, a name tag gleaming proudly on her chest. Maureen's practiced smile flickered warmly at the new arrivals, offering hushed welcomes and offers of premium coffee or champagne. But when her eyes slid over to Amira, something in her expression cooled. Just a fraction, almost imperceptibly. The smile froze, thinned. She didn't approach Amira. Instead, she turned slightly, speaking to the cluster of new passengers, but keeping Amira firmly in her peripheral vision, as if monitoring a potential problem rather than welcoming a guest. It wasn't the first time Amira had seen that look, where clothes, posture, and skin color whispered to the world that maybe she didn't belong. She felt it like a faint vibration under her skin, one she had spent years learning to ignore. At the small service counter where lounge attendants checked boarding passes, Maureen drifted by, her polished nails tapping lightly on the counter, as if she were simply passing time. But her eyes flicked discreetly to the tablet screen, where passenger names glowed under seat assignments. She spotted it easily enough, Amira Ellington, 2A, Skynova VIP status. Still, Maureen's brows pinched together for the briefest moment before smoothing over into the practiced neutrality demanded by years of service. Amira pretended not to notice. She tucked a lock of curly hair behind her ear and kept her eyes on her notebook. Just get to Atlanta. That was all that mattered. Soon, a soft chime sounded. Attention, ladies and gentlemen. Skynova Flight 612 is now boarding. We invite our first class and VIP passengers to begin boarding at gate 34. Amira rose, slipping her notebook and phone into her backpack. She smoothed her hoodie, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the gate. She joined the VIP boarding line, standing a few paces behind a man in a tailored navy suit scrolling on his phone. As she moved forward, she caught the slight stiffening of Maureen's posture. The flight attendant's eyes scanned her from head to toe, lingering a beat too long on the scuffed sneakers, the casual backpack, the simple hoodie. Maureen stepped forward, her polite smile stretched taut across her face. Her hand hovered near the scanner, ready to double-check Amira's boarding pass, though the line hadn't jammed, and no other passenger had been stopped like this. Amira felt the tightening in the air, the moment when suspicion and judgment wrapped themselves into a tidy, familiar package. A single sentence poised on Maureen's lips, one Amira had heard in a dozen different versions, from schoolyards to corporate elevators. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" The words hadn't come yet, but Amira could feel them humming in the space between them. And what neither of them knew, what Maureen couldn't have imagined, was that with that one glance, that one assumption, she wasn't just challenging a young woman. She was challenging the very legacy that paid for the wings keeping Sky Nova aloft. Amira took a steadying breath, clutching her boarding pass just a little tighter. One heartbeat, then another. The story wasn't just beginning, it was already underway, and neither of them had any idea how it was going to end. Boarding announcements crackled through the overhead speakers, calling first-class passengers to line up. Amira adjusted the strap of her backpack and moved with the others toward the jet bridge. She could feel it almost immediately. The slow ripple of glances, the way conversations dropped into low murmurs when she passed by. It wasn't new. She'd walked through spaces like this her whole life, spaces where people tried to decide if she fit, where they weighed her against whatever picture they had in their heads of who belonged. As she reached the entrance to the plane, Amira told herself what she always did. Just breathe. Keep moving. You're not here for them. You're here for Mom. The flight attendants stood at the door, bright smiles pinned in place. Maureen Clifton, with her neat chignon and perfectly creased uniform, was the first to step forward. Her eyes flicked over Amira's clothes, hoodie, jeans, scuffed sneakers, with a look that was too quick to be friendly, too sharp to be welcoming. Amira offered her boarding pass with a polite nod. Maureen took it with the barest hint of hesitation, glancing at the screen, then back at Amira's face, then back at the pass again, as if some mistake had been made. "This section is for our VIP passengers," Maureen said, the edge of doubt coloring her otherwise sweet tone. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Amira kept her voice even. "C2A. Sky Nova VIP." Maureen's mouth twitched, half smile, half something else. She handed the boarding pass back without a word, but followed Amira's progress down the aisle with narrowed eyes. Amira found her seat, a spacious window spot right near the front. She stowed her backpack under the seat in front of her and sat down quietly, pulling out a book to pass the time. She didn't have long. Maureen reappeared, her hands clasped together like she was delivering bad news she had nothing to do with. "Excuse me," Maureen said, bending slightly at the waist, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. "This area is reserved for our premium guests. I'll need you to move to economy, please." Amira blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat." Maureen didn't even glance at the boarding pass again. Her smile tightened. "We have standards to maintain. I'll ask you to cooperate." Across the aisle, a few heads turned. A businessman in a tailored suit openly stared, lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't far off either. In the background, near the galley, Devin Cray, one of the ground crew, caught the exchange. He shifted from foot to foot, uncertain. Devin had seen enough training videos to know what was happening. He'd also seen what happened when junior staff tried to step into these situations. His last attempt had landed him a formal warning about overstepping his role. Still, his fingers itched to intervene. Meanwhile, Amira reached for her phone with steady hands. She pulled up the Sky Nova app, displaying her reservation, C2A, marked clearly with the VIP badge. She held it up wordlessly. Maureen leaned closer, squinting at the screen for half a second before pulling back, her smile brittle. "I'm sorry, but there must be a system error. Please come with me. Let's not cause a scene." The phrase "cause a scene" was like a slap. Amira's shoulders stiffened. The message was clear: don't make this difficult. Don't make people uncomfortable. She swallowed the words burning on her tongue. With slow, deliberate movements, she gathered her backpack, slid it over one shoulder, and stood. As she stepped into the aisle, a middle-aged woman with a pearl necklace leaned toward her husband and whispered just loud enough. Probably booked the wrong class. You can always tell. The husband grunted in agreement, not bothering to hide his amusement. Amira's throat tightened, but she kept her face composed. She walked past Maureen without another glance, feeling the weight of a dozen stares trailing behind her like thick, invisible chains. Devon Cray watched her go, anger simmering low in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, then shut it again, his jaw clenching. Not yet. Not now. Amira found a seat in economy near the back, squeezed between a window and a teenage boy scrolling through his phone. She sat down slowly, placed her bag at her feet, and rested her hands in her lap. Outside the window, the last beams of afternoon sun stretched long and golden across the tarmac, painting everything in a soft, forgiving light. Amira stared at the light for a long time, blinking hard against the sting gathering behind her eyes. It wasn't the seat that hurt. It wasn't even the looks or the whispers. It was the reminder, fresh and sharp, that no matter how far she traveled, no matter what her name carried, there would always be people ready to strip her down to what they thought they saw. And yet, sitting there, surrounded by strangers who hadn't lifted a finger, Amira made herself a quiet promise. This moment would not define her. She would make sure of that. Word by word, step by step, breath by breath. One day, they'd understand what they had missed when they only saw a hoodie and sneakers. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft glow as the plane settled into cruising altitude. In the tight rows of economy class, Amira leaned her head back against the seat, staring at the low ceiling above her. The hum of the engines filled the space around her, a steady sound that should have been comforting, but somehow only deepened the ache in her chest. The seat barely fit her shoulders, and her knees brushed against the seat in front of her every time she shifted. She tucked her backpack closer under the seat and folded her arms tightly, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. She closed her eyes, willing herself to focus on her breathing. Slow and steady, slow and steady. Across the plane, separated by a curtain and a lifetime of assumptions, Maureen Clifton moved through the plush rows of business class. Her heels clicked smartly against the carpet, her smile wide and effortless. She poured champagne with a flourish, offered warm towels with a practiced grace. Every now and then, her gaze would flick toward the economy section, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if checking to make sure the problem was contained. It was during one of these glances that a passenger in a designer suit leaned toward Maureen, his voice low but unmistakably curious. "What happened with that young woman earlier?" he asked, lifting his crystal glass slightly. Maureen chuckled lightly, an easy practice sound. "Just a misunderstanding," she said, straightening his napkin with a quick, almost maternal gesture. "We have to maintain certain standards up here, you know. Sometimes it's better not to cause embarrassment." The man nodded knowingly, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was a small exchange, just a few words, but Amira, even from rows away, caught the shift in the air, the way judgment traveled faster than any in-flight announcement. Her phone buzzed gently in her lap. She tilted the screen toward herself and felt her stomach drop. Call from Emory Hospital. Text, "Mom moved to ICU. Stable for now. Please call when you land." Amira gripped the phone tighter, her thumb hovering over the screen. For a long moment, she just stared at the words, the tiny blinking cursor, as if it were some kind of heartbeat on its own. Then she closed her eyes again, fighting the urge to cry. Not here. Not now. Her mother's face swam in her mind, smiling despite the foredrip, squeezing Amira's hand with a strength that belied her frail body. That was what mattered. Getting home to her, being there, holding her hand through whatever came next. She drew a shaky breath and leaned her head against the window. Outside, the sky stretched endless and dark, sprinkled with distant stars that seemed so close you could almost touch them if you only tried hard enough. Around her, the passengers who had whispered and stared earlier now shifted uncomfortably. They weren't looking anymore, but some had seen the text pop up when Amira's phone lit. They caught the way her fingers trembled, the way she blinked rapidly against tears she wouldn't let fall. A woman a few rows ahead tugged awkwardly at her scarf, shooting a quick, guilty glance backward. A teenager sitting next to Amira shifted slightly, pulling out one of his earbuds as if debating whether to say something, then thought better of it and turned back to his screen. Amira didn't notice. Or, if she did, she didn't react. She was somewhere else entirely. In a hospital room, in a quiet prayer, in the silent promise she made herself every time life threw another wall in her way. Hold on. Stay still. Keep moving. The flight attendants began their final pass through the cabin, collecting trash, checking seatbelts. Maureen didn't come back into economy. She stayed comfortably up front, offering extra desserts and complimentary drinks to the passengers she deemed worthy. Devin Cray, however, moved quietly through the aisle. His clipboard was tucked discreetly under one arm, but his eyes were sharp, taking in everything. The slumped shoulders, the quick glances, the tension that still clung to the back rows. As he passed Amira's seat, he slowed just slightly, almost imperceptibly. In his mind, he filed away the details. The unjust treatment, the unnecessary humiliation, the silent strength with which Amira bore it all. Devin wasn't new to this kind of thing. He had seen it before, tucked neatly under the rug, smoothed over with corporate apologies and training videos. But this time felt different. Maybe it was the raw hurt he saw flicker across Amira's face. Maybe it was the way the air around her seemed heavier, charged with something bigger than just one wrong seat assignment. He made a quiet decision. When the plane landed, he would write it all up. No softening, no smoothing. The airline's new diversity policy wasn't just a poster on the break room wall. Not to him. The overhead speakers crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Atlanta. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts. Amira straightened slowly, tucking her phone into her pocket, her hands folding tightly in her lap. As the plane dipped slightly toward Earth, she closed her eyes one last time and whispered a silent prayer, not for herself, but for strength. Strength to face whatever waited at the end of this silent flight. Strength to remember who she was, no matter where they tried to put her. The seatbelt sign blinked on with a soft chime, and the captain's voice crackled over the speakers, steady but with an edge of urgency. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Atlanta. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your seatbacks are in the upright position. Amira adjusted the strap across her lap, her fingers brushing over the cool metal buckle. She stared out the window, watching the lights of Atlanta grow brighter against the darkening sky. She should have been relieved to be almost home, but instead, a tight knot formed in her stomach. She could feel the weight of the entire flight pressing down on her shoulders, the silent judgment, the humiliation she had endured without a single raised voice. Somewhere near the cockpit, a quiet conversation was unfolding, far away from the buzz of the passengers. Lawrence Grant, Skynova's head of customer operations, had just placed a call to the captain. His voice was low but urgent. "There's been a serious oversight," he said. "You have a V.I.P. on board Amira Ellington. She's the daughter of Ellis Ellington, owner of Skynova. Ensure she's treated properly. I want a senior team waiting at the gate. No mistakes." The captain, a seasoned man with decades in the air, paused for a beat longer than necessary. He looked toward the closed curtain separating first class from the economy section, his mind racing. He had seen the reports, heard the quiet buzz of something unusual during boarding. Now it all made sense. He tapped his headset. "Understood," he said simply, though 100 questions swirled in his head. How had they missed this? How much damage had been done already? Meanwhile, back in economy, Amira shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She hadn't touched the complimentary water bottle tucked in the seat pocket. Her book remained closed on her lap. She could feel the beginning of a headache blooming behind her eyes. A few rows ahead, Devin Cray glanced at her again. He was checking the cabin as part of the descent checklist, but his eyes kept drifting back to Amira, to the quiet way she sat, shoulders stiff, gaze distant. As he passed, the captain caught his eye and gave a subtle nod toward the galley. Devin ducked behind the curtain, heart thudding. The captain's voice was low. We need a full report. Everything that happened with passenger Amira Ellington. Quietly. No drama. Devon's heart dropped. He knew that name. Everybody at Skynova knew that name. And now all the little moments he had witnessed, the dismissive looks, the forced relocation, clicked into sharp, awful focus. He nodded. I saw everything, he said. I'll have it written up by the time we land. The captain pressed his lips into a tight line. Good. Be ready. This won't stay quiet for long. Back at her seat, Amira remained still, unaware of the ripple effect her presence had just triggered. She had chosen to remain silent, not because she was weak, but because some battles weren't worth fighting in front of strangers. She had thought enduring quietly was the right choice. Now it seemed her silence would not shield her after all. As the plane began its final descent, the city lights of Atlanta glittered like a scattered handful of jewels. Amira felt the soft bump of turbulence, but didn't react. She pressed her forehead lightly against the cool plastic window, closing her eyes. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted the fanfare, the fuss, or the inevitable fallout. She just wanted to see her mother, hold her hand, tell her she was home. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The wheels thudded against the tarmac, jolting the plane into a fast, humming roll down the runway. A few passengers clapped quietly, a half-hearted tradition. The engines whined as the plane slowed, turning toward the gate. Amira sat motionless, feeling the heavy stillness that had settled over her. Somewhere ahead, the senior management team gathered near the gate, straightening their jackets, checking their badges. The small, private storm brewing inside the plane was about to break wide open. Devon Cray tucked his clipboard under his arm, his jaw set. He had made up his mind. He would not let what happened go unspoken. Not this time. In business class, Maureen Clifton smoothed her skirt and checked her reflection in the galley mirror. She was already thinking about dinner plans in Atlanta, blissfully unaware of the hurricane heading her way. Amira unfastened her seatbelt and rose from her seat slowly. Around her, passengers began pulling down luggage and jostling for position in the aisle. She stayed still for a moment longer, gathering herself. She knew the moment she stepped off this plane, things would change. Not because she wanted them to, but because sometimes the world left you no choice. With a deep breath, she reached for her backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and stepped into the narrow aisle, ready, or at least as ready as she would ever be, to face what waited on the other side. The plane rolled steadily toward the gate, a low rumble shaking through the cabin floor. Passengers shifted in their seats, unbuckling their belts prematurely despite the captain's reminder over the intercom to stay seated. Over the heads of the crowd, Amira caught sight of movement outside the window. Dark suits lined up neatly on the jet bridge, badges flashing under the fluorescent lights. It wasn't normal. She straightened slightly, her heart thudding harder than the engines outside. Those weren't just gate agents. Those were senior executives. She knew the uniforms, the polished shoes, the clipped urgency in the way they stood. Across the aisle, Maureen Clifton stole a glance through the narrow slit in the door window. Her smile faltered. A small wrinkle formed between her eyebrows as she whispered to a fellow attendant, her voice tight. What's going on? Did we get an audit surprise? She didn't get an answer. Devon Cray, clipboard in hand, moved swiftly down the aisle toward the cockpit. He caught the captain just as the final brakes squealed. They're here for a special passenger. Devon muttered low enough that only the captain heard. Ellington's daughter. The captain gave a single nod, face neutral but firm. No more mistakes. Amira sat frozen. Her instincts screamed to stay invisible, to let it blow over. But deep down, another voice fought its way forward. The voice that reminded her how often silence had allowed injustice to slip by unnoticed. If she stayed silent, what happened today would keep happening. Not just to her, to others who didn't have a powerful last name to protect them. And wasn't that the real problem? The curtain separating business class from economy was pulled back abruptly. Lawrence Grant, the regional operations manager, stepped onto the plane with all the authority of a man used to fixing disasters before they hit the headlines. He was tall, gray-haired, immaculately dressed, and he moved with the smooth confidence of someone who didn't have to check twice to know where he stood. Passengers craned their necks to see who he was looking for. Lawrence didn't hesitate. His eyes scanned briefly until they locked onto Amira. Then he smiled, not the practiced airline smile, but a genuine one, and walked straight to her row. He bent slightly at the waist in a formal, respectful gesture. "Miss Ellington," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by everyone nearby without feeling staged. "On behalf of Skynova, I'd like to personally apologize for your experience today. We are honored to have you with us." The name hit the cabin like a dropped glass shattering on tile. Ellington. A ripple of recognition spread. Whispers swirled. Passengers turned to each other, eyes wide with a sudden realization. Maureen Clifton, still standing near the galley, went sheet white. Her hands, perfectly steady moments ago, now trembled as she gripped the seat back in front of her. Devin Cray, watching from the jump seat, felt a small flicker of vindication. Not because Amira was someone important, but because maybe now, just maybe, the pattern would finally break. Amira stood slowly. She could feel the heat of 100 stares on her back, the brittle weight of people scrambling to rewrite the narrative they'd built around her based on nothing but appearance. She slung her backpack over one shoulder, lifting her chin a little higher than she felt inside. Her voice was calm, but carried enough steel to cut through the tension. "Thank you," she said simply to Lawrence. No speeches. No dramatics. Just the quiet dignity that had always been hers, long before the Ellington name meant anything to these people. Lawrence extended an arm politely to guide her forward, but she shook her head lightly. "I'll walk out like everyone else," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Lawrence stepped aside without hesitation, giving her space. As Amira moved down the aisle, faces turned away, then back again, guilty, curious, embarrassed. Some passengers gave small, awkward nods. Others simply dropped their gazes to their laps, pretending they had never seen her, never judged her. She passed Maureen on the way. The older woman looked like she wanted to speak, to apologize, to claw back what couldn't be undone. But Amira didn't slow. She didn't even look at her. Some things were better left in silence. She stepped onto the jet bridge, where the cool air rushed up to meet her, crisp and clean after the heavy, stale cabin. Behind her, the door hissed shut. In that simple act, walking out without fanfare, without bitterness, Amira claimed a different kind of victory. Not the one shouted from rooftops. The quiet, resolute kind that mattered more. Inside the plane, Maureen Clifton sagged against the galley wall, the reality of her choices crashing down all at once. Devin Cray watched her for a long second, then turned away, following Amira into the night. Because sometimes, dignity wasn't about the noise you made. It was about the noise you refused to make. The air inside the plane felt heavier now, almost thick enough to cut. As Amira stood in the aisle, she caught a glimpse of Lawrence, Grant near the front. His posture was firm but respectful, an open hand gesturing toward the side door where a private vehicle waited just beyond the jet bridge. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Miss Ellington, if you prefer, we can escort you out discreetly. VIP access. Private exit." Amira looked at him for a long moment. She appreciated the offer. She knew it came from a place of genuine care, maybe even a little fear of making a bigger mess. But that wasn't the choice that sat right in her chest. Her voice was steady as she answered, loud enough for others nearby to catch every word. "I appreciate it, but I'll walk out with everyone else. I'm no different from them. I'm just a person, same as anybody here." Lawrence gave a small nod, stepping aside with a quiet, approving smile. No more words were needed. Before she could take a step forward, though, a flurry of movement caught her eye. Maureen Clifton was weaving through the narrow aisle, her face pale but determined. She stopped a few feet away, wringing her hands together, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know who you were," Maureen said, her words rushed and desperate. "I never meant to cause offense. I was just trying to maintain the standards we're expected to uphold." The apology hung awkwardly between them, weighed down by all the things that went unsaid. Amira studied her for a beat, letting the silence stretch longer than was comfortable. Then, without raising her voice, she cut in, calm, clear, and sharp as glass. "Standards don't give you the right to judge people by how they look," she said. "If I weren't Amira Ellington, if I were just some regular girl in a hoodie, you wouldn't be sorry right now. And that's the real problem." There was no anger in her tone, no shouting, just an unmistakable sadness, the kind that comes from knowing a truth too big and too old to ignore anymore. Around them, the cabin stirred. Passengers shifted uneasily, stealing glances at each other. Some of the same faces that had smirked or sneered when Amira first boarded now looked down at their shoes or fiddled with their carry-ons, shame creeping up their necks. Devin Cray, standing nearby, straightened his shoulders. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and quietly offered his presence beside Amira, like a silent shield against the weight of the room. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his voice low and respectful. Amira nodded and began to walk. Each step down the aisle felt heavier than the last, but she didn't falter. She moved past rows of travelers who parted instinctively, leaving a narrow path. Some nodded in quiet apology. Others couldn't meet her eyes. The humiliation she had endured earlier had transformed into something else now, something they couldn't ignore or dismiss. She could feel their eyes following her, not with mockery, but with something much closer to respect. Behind her, Maureen Clifton stood rooted to the floor, her arms hanging uselessly at her sides. No one came to her defense. No one offered a comforting word. She was alone, left to wrestle with the consequences of her own decisions. The moment Amira stepped off the plane, cool air hit her face, fresh and bracing after the stifling atmosphere inside. The muted clatter of the airport filled her ears, luggage wheels clicking across tile, quiet conversations, distant announcements. Ordinary sounds of ordinary people, all going about their lives. And she was part of them. No more, no less. Lawrence Grant watched her from a respectful distance, giving her the space she clearly wanted. Devin stayed close, but silent, ready if she needed anything. Amira didn't look back. She didn't need to. The door had closed behind her, literally and figuratively, and what waited ahead was hers to define. There was a kind of dignity in that. A quiet, stubborn dignity that no boarding pass or VIP lounge could ever grant or take away. As she merged into the stream of passengers heading toward baggage claim, blending seamlessly into the crowd, she allowed herself a small smile. Today hadn't gone the way she planned. But maybe, just maybe, it had gone the way it needed to. The arrival hall at Atlanta's airport buzzed with the low, restless energy of a city that never truly slept. Families reunited with hugs and shouts. Travelers dragged heavy suitcases past sleepy-eyed drivers holding cardboard signs, and the scent of stale coffee hung thick in the air. But at one corner of the terminal, just past the security checkpoint, a different kind of tension brewed. Skynova's public relations team, crisp in their navy blazers, clustered together with somber faces. Photographers stood by, their cameras slung low but ready. Legal representatives whispered urgently to one another, shuffling papers and checking their watches. In a quiet conference room tucked behind the VIP lounge, a closed-door meeting was already underway. At the long table sat Maureen Clifton, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white against her skin. Across from her, a panel of Skynova executives wore matching expressions, disappointment mixed with something colder. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Cheryl Watts, leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "Miss Clifton," she said, "we've reviewed passenger statements, internal flight logs, and testimony from crew members. We'd like to hear your side clearly. Why was Miss Amira Ellington asked to leave her assigned seat?" Maureen cleared her throat, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room boring into her. Her mind scrambled for explanations that would soften what had happened, but none came that didn't sound hollow. "I was following procedure," Maureen said, her voice thinner than she'd intended. "We have an expectation for appearance standards in the premium cabin. I thought." Cheryl raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. Appearance standards do not give you permission to override paid seat assignments, nor to judge a passenger's eligibility based on how they look. There it was. No sugarcoating. No room for excuses. Devin Cray sat quietly along the wall, a silent observer. His statement, already filed and reviewed, detailed exactly what he had witnessed, how Amira had been treated, how assumptions had ruled over facts. The room fell silent for a beat. Another executive spoke up, his tone clipped. "Miss Clifton, do you have any documented complaint, any security concern regarding Miss Ellington beyond her clothing or demeanor?" Maureen's mouth opened, then closed again. There was no way to spin it. No way to make her snap judgment look like anything but what it was. "No," she admitted finally, voice cracking just slightly. I made a mistake." Cheryl nodded, almost sadly. One that reflects directly on Skynova's values and reputation. Within the hour, the decision came down swiftly and without ceremony. Maureen Clifton was terminated, effective immediately. Skynova issued an internal apology to all staff, and a public apology to Amira Ellington was prepared for release, to be distributed through all the company's internal communication channels. It wasn't just about saving face. It was about making it clear that what happened wasn't acceptable and wouldn't be tolerated again. Meanwhile, in a quieter part of the airport, Amira stood with Lawrence Grant near a row of large windows overlooking the tarmac. Planes taxied by under the fading evening sky, their lights blinking steady and sure against the dusk. Lawrence turned toward her, his expression apologetic but respectful. "Miss Ellington, if you wish to pursue legal action or further disciplinary steps, the company will support whatever you decide." Amira thought for a moment, letting the hum of the airport fill the space between them. She could push harder. She could take it to court, make it national news, hold Maureen up as a public example. No one would blame her. But that wasn't what she wanted. She looked at Lawrence, her voice calm, her eyes clear. "I don't need retribution," she said. "I just hope she remembers this the next time she looks at someone and thinks she already knows their worth." Lawrence gave a small nod. It wasn't grand or flashy, but there was weight in it, a recognition that sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought quietly. Amira gathered her backpack and walked toward the exit, weaving through the ordinary crowd of travelers. No special escort, no cameras flashing. Just another person moving through the messy, beautiful chaos of the world. And it felt right. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She had stood her ground not just for herself, but for every quiet soul who ever sat down where they belonged and got told they didn't. Outside, the cool night air brushed against her cheeks, carrying with it the scent of rain and possibilities. Amira smiled to herself, small but sure, and stepped into the night, knowing she'd carried her dignity with her all the way through. The soft beeping of hospital monitors was the first thing Amira heard as she pushed open the door to her mother's room. It had been a few days since Atlanta, but the weight of everything that happened still pressed against her shoulders like a second skin. Her mother, Ruth Ellington, looked smaller than Amira remembered, her skin pale against the starched white sheets. But her eyes, always sharp and full of knowing, lit up the moment she saw her daughter. Amira smiled and crossed the room, taking her mother's hand gently between hers. She sat down without speaking at first, just letting the moment breathe. After a while, Ruth gave her that look, the one that said, "Don't think you can hide anything from me, child." "So," Ruth said, her voice a little raspy but steady, "how was your flight?" Amira laughed softly, a sound that carried more weight than it should have. "Eventful," she said. She told her mother about the flight, the misunderstanding, the awkward stares, and even the apology. She left out the details about Maureen Clifton, the termination, the public apology. Those parts didn't seem important right now. She thought maybe Ruth would scold her for making waves, for drawing attention. But instead, her mother's thin fingers tightened around hers, and she smiled, proud and soft all at once. "You don't have to prove your worth to anybody, Amira," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if standing up made even one person think twice before judging another, then you did right." Amira blinked against the sudden sting behind her eyes. She nodded, letting the truth of her mother's words settle deep inside her, in that quiet place where real strength was built. Meanwhile, across town, Maureen Clifton was learning her own lessons. She had spent the first few days angry, at the airline, at the passengers, even at Amira. But as the noise faded, and as the messages piled up, some angry, some disappointed, she found herself staring at the ceiling late into the night, unable to sleep. The truth gnawed at her in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't that Amira had been the daughter of someone important. It was that Maureen had never thought to ask, had never thought it might matter. She had judged a person by their shoes, their hoodie, their skin. She hadn't seen the human being sitting in front of her. And now, stripped of her job, her reputation bruised, Maureen finally understood the real cost of her choices. At Skynova headquarters, the company took a different route. A mandatory workshop was organized, aimed at reshaping the culture from the inside out. It wasn't perfect. Change never was. But it was a start. Amira received an invitation to attend the session, anonymously if she wished. She thought about it for a long time before agreeing. On the morning of the meeting, she sent a letter instead of speaking. It was short, but it carried the weight of everything she had lived through. You never know what battles the person sitting next to you is fighting. You never know the roads they walk to be here. But kindness needs no reason. Choose it anyway. They read the letter aloud at the workshop, and for a moment, the room held its breath. No lectures, no anger, just the simple truth laid bare. Weeks later, on a different flight, a young flight attendant straightened the crisp collar of her uniform and glanced around the first-class cabin as passengers boarded. A man in a worn jacket and battered jeans settled into a seat near the front. For a split second, the attendant hesitated, old habits tugging at her. Then she smiled, stepped forward, and offered him a warm, genuine welcome. No questions asked, no assumptions made. He smiled back, the kind of smile that said he had noticed the difference. And so a small change bloomed, quiet and steady, like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending ripples far beyond what anyone could see. Amira didn't need to hear about it to know, because real change, the kind that mattered, didn't need a spotlight. It lived in the choices people made when no one was watching. She understood now that you didn't have to shout to shift the world. Sometimes you just had to stand your ground, hold your dignity close, and let it speak for you. You didn't have to be loud to be strong. You didn't have to be famous to make a difference. Sometimes, the world was moved most by the ones who refused to move at all. Maybe it's easy to believe we can spot someone's worth with just a glance. But sometimes it's the quiet strength, the simple dignity, that carries the greatest power to change the world around us. What would happen if we chose kindness first, without needing a reason? If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories. Your support helps keep these voices alive.